Hi, this is Dwayne from Trifecta Wellbeing, and I want to briefly address a term that we hear tossed around quite often in our industry and in our field, and I'm sure it's one that you've heard. It's one that we've been addressing this week in Trifecta Wellbeing. It's the term willpower. I don't know what you think about when you hear the term willpower. It may bring up a lot of shame. It may bring up a lot of guilt. It may bring up a lot of why bother? I have no willpower. I've heard people joke that around the holiday season they tend to lose willpower, or they lose willpower when they're out with their friends, or they're around desserts, or someone brings something sweet into the office and they say, that's when my willpower goes completely out the door. There are a lot of thoughts about willpower that you can Google and find, and a lot of articles and research have been done on willpower. And it can be really confusing and complicated. And I'm not going to pretend tonight to undo all of that for you and to arrive at some explanation that will work for you. I often hear as I'm working with clients who are struggling with addictions about, I suppose I did not have enough willpower. It's if they're white knuckling life and holding on for dear life and probably using the emergency brake on their car instead of actually tapping the brake, learning how to slow down. It seems like something that's very extreme to talk about willpower. The American Psychological Association defines willpower as the ability to resist short term temptation in order to reach long term goals. Now, that seems somewhat doable. And there may be times that we need a little willpower in our life to get us to where we're eventually wanting to go. I may need a little willpower in order to watch my tongue when I could bite someone with a critical comment, or to bypass a certain food choice that is not in my food or not in my fuel category. That's when willpower could potentially come into play. But the thing that I find in working with individuals who use this term willpower is that they tend to eventually say they run out of willpower. Some people treat willpower like a muscle. It's something that after a while will give out and they don't continue to make the choices that they're making. They become exhausted and they just simply give in. But maybe what we could do is turn that around, reframe it, and look at it differently. I suppose when we're thinking about overcoming some obstacle in our life, whether it could be our misuse of food or misuse of alcohol, or even the way we're thinking about a particular situation, it's really helpful if we begin with how we are thinking about that particular situation. You see, our beliefs about a certain issue begin to build certain behaviors. And many times we want to attribute our lack of completing something to a lack of willpower. Eventually, what that begins to produce in us is probably a sense of guilt, or more importantly, to produce in us a sense of shame. And shame is about identity and about worth. Thinking that I suppose this is not worthy of me. I don't have the power to do it, so why should I consider trying to complete it? That can be defeating, can it? Especially when guilt and shame become compounded in our lives. And maybe if we've had some traumas from our past, some traumas from our childhood, or even some traumas in our adult life, that shame can be pretty effective in keeping us bound and keeping us locked up. And there's nothing worse than adding a word like willpower to it. And eventually we begin to think that we can't achieve exactly what we're setting out for. If you look at the history of the use of the word willpower, it is centered around shame. And quite particularly around the use of alcohol. I guess that person did not have enough willpower in order to stay sober. Life is much more complicated than a term or even defining that term. We have many variables that interact with us on a daily basis. I like to imagine that we are a circle, and the circle represents ourself. And inside that circle, we have the physical aspects, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual. And we are always, at any time, interacting with our environment. We're either enlarging ourselves, or in many cases, we might be shrinking ourselves because we're not allowing ourselves to be influenced in ways that promote our growth. So when I think about willpower and I think about the idea of willpower, I think if we turn that around a little bit and maybe played with the word, we could talk about the power to will something. I don't mean that in a magical way that we can say an incantation and something's going to happen. I quit believing in magical thinking a long time ago. But there is something powerful about the way we think and believe about a situation. Let me give you an example. Let's say that there's an individual named Hank. It's a fictitious name. Actually, Hank is the name of one of my dogs, and I like to use that name quite often when I give examples because I don't really know a lot of Hanks in life. And let's say that Hank is quite successful in his life. He works out, he's athletic, he has a good job, he has a lot going for him, but Hank struggles with two things. Hank struggles with food and struggles with alcohol. And Hank begins to think that after a while that he doesn't have the willpower to not overeat and to not overdrink. But this is what's interesting about Hank. If you sat and had a conversation with Hank for any period of time, you would soon discover that Hank has a lot of will and a lot of power to do other things. Hank doesn't miss work. Hank doesn't miss his time at the gym. Hank doesn't miss the time with his friends. Hank doesn't miss the time serving in his community. Many people would look at Hank and say, wow, you are so motivated. You have such willpower. You have your life together. But the problem is that when Hank comes home and is with himself, he tends to indulge. Now, would we say that Hank lacks willpower when, on the one hand, Hank has a lot of will to power a lot of things in his life, and he has the power to will a lot of good things in his life? Or would we say that Hank potentially has a lot of beliefs about himself that gets in the way? Would we say that Hank potentially needs to set back and challenge his beliefs about productivity, about meaning, about success, about life? Could it be that Hank needs to look at his circle and begin to think more about himself physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually? Maybe Hank needs to challenge and interrogate some of the thoughts that he has. Because remember, your beliefs build behaviors. You see, maybe Hank thinks that unless he completes all of these things and does them to the best of his ability, that he won't be successful. Maybe he thinks that he won't be accepted. Maybe he ties his worth too much to these things that he does. I don't think any of us would think that Hank doesn't have a lot of willpower. It's just maybe a faulty belief system about what is success, what is meaning, what is identity. And maybe by challenging these thoughts, challenging these beliefs or these cognitive distortions, maybe Hank could begin to change how he's looking at food and looking at alcohol as being a way to disassociate, as a way to emotionally take care of himself. And maybe that could change for Hank. Maybe he could see that he has the power to will something differently based out of his beliefs influencing his behavior. Willpower. There's a lot to this. But at Trifecta, when we talk about willpower, we talk about making choices that derive from our value systems. And our value systems are informed by our beliefs, which build our behaviors. That's something that's important for us to consider. So the next time someone challenges you about not having enough willpower and begins to shake the critical finger of shame at you, maybe you push back a little bit. And maybe it's time for you to ask or maybe evaluate your own belief system that is getting in the way of you accomplishing the goals that you have set for yourself out of your vision to truly go after the life that you really crave.